Whenever a new generation of Pokemon comes around, the trading card game is soon to follow with adapting all of these new Pokemon and characters into the game. With each new game or new generation, we also tend to see a new mechanic, card type or rule change as well. Recently, with the release of Legends ZA, we have seen the revival of Mega Evolution Pokemon, which haven't been seen in the game since the X and Y series of sets, despite them also being featured in other games such as Sun and Moon. A lot of the time, these changes to the game as well as new cards can be very impactful and on occasion, very controversial. The new Mega Evolution cards, for example, when they were first revealed, gave a lot of players flashbacks to the Sun and Moon era when tag teams were introduced. While tag team Pokemon did quickly take over the game in what many people say is the worst format in the game's history, Mega Pokemon currently aren't really doing that much. Players saw the free prize card text and immediately started panicking. When a new card type or mechanic is introduced into the TCG, it tends to be an evolution of an already existing card type, a revival of an old card type as we have seen with the recent Mega Pokemon, as well as with Ace-Spec cards, or it could be something completely new as the Pokemon Company want to create a fresh format for the game. However, there was one era of the Pokemon TCG that many players still talk about to this day. Some even say it was worse than the tag team era. A period where the game saw one of the biggest changes to not only its rules, but the future of card design in general. Power creep doesn't even begin to describe how huge this change was, as a new type of card would completely change the game forever. But first, let's start from the beginning when everything was black and white. Pokemon Black and White base set was released all the way back in April of 2011. As with most sets of a new era, it was alright, but did feature some pretty powerful cards such as Emboar, Reshiram, Zekrom, and Professor Juniper. However, by far the biggest thing that came with its release was changes to the rules of the game. Changes that went on to create one of the most toxic periods to play the game. Prior to the release of Black and White, the basic rules of the game were as follows. The winner of the coin flip must go first. The player going first must draw a card at the start of their turn. The player going first can attack, but by far the biggest rule, the player going first cannot play supporters, stadiums, or trainer cards. So if you were unlucky enough to win the coin flip, you could do almost nothing on your first turn except bench more Pokemon and attach energy, if you had one. I never thought winning the coin flip would be detrimental to a player, but with the release of Black and White, this one rule was changed. Now, when going first, you can play supporters, stadiums, and trainer cards, and this change instantly destroyed the format. Released in the set Stormfront was a little card called Sableye. This Pokemon has the Overeager ability, which said if Sableye is your active Pokemon at the beginning of the game, you go first. This card did kinda fix one thing about the going first issue, as its attack let you search your deck for a supporter card, discard it, and then use the effect of that card as the effect of this attack. So while you couldn't play Overtrainer cards, you could at least use a supporter. However, with these new rule changes, this card became a staple. Your opponent won the coin flip? Well, too bad because I have Sableye, so I'm going first. And going first during this time meant you could either set up your board incredibly quickly, or just win the game immediately. Since you were now allowed to play trainers and supporters and stadiums, this meant that with Sableye you could play 2 supporter cards on your first turn. Thanks to its attack, which I forgot to mention also costs 0 energy to use. That's already pretty busted, but Sableye also had a second attack. For 1 dark energy it did 10 damage, but if the defending Pokemon had less HP remaining than Sableye, it did 40 damage instead. It didn't take long before an FTK, also known as First Turn Kill, was discovered. The key card of this FTK being Crobat G, which when benched let you place 1 damage counter on any of your opponent's Pokemon. So with the help of a bunch of scoop up cards, you could loop Crobat G over and over and over again, get the HP of your opponent's Pokemon lower than Sableye, and then attach a Darkness Energy, which by the way was a special energy at the time and added an extra 10 damage to attacks, and with enough Flash Bites, you could immediately win the game on your first turn, unless your opponent had multiple Pokemon in their opening hand and benched all of them, which you were now forced to do just so you didn't instantly lose. Because of this, the Pokemon Company had to step in as so many people were complaining about these changes and the chaos it had caused. So they announced that the game would be receiving an early mid-season rotation. Back then, rotations would normally occur a month after the World Championships, which would be around September time, allowing players to start a new season with a fresh format. However, the 2011 rotation would instead be occurring in July, only 2 months after the release of Black and White, as well as the new rule changes. This rotation would remove the remaining Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum sets from the game, meaning that the format would now be from Heart Gold and Soul Silver onwards. The format was saved, and the late 2011 season after this rotation was fairly diverse. We also saw the release of 2 more sets, those being Emerging Powers and Noble Victories, which brought even more powerful cards into the format such as Electric, Pokemon Catcher, Terrakion, and possibly one of the strongest cards ever printed, N. I could make an entire video about this card, that's just how impactful it was for the game. 2012 was on the horizon, and with it would be coming the next set of the Black and White era, a set that would go on to completely change the game forever, creating what a lot of people say is the worst format the game has ever seen and the year that almost killed the Pokemon TCG. You've probably heard the name before, Next Destinies. Released in February of 2012, Next Destinies would bring the return of a type of card we haven't seen since the Ruby and Sapphire era, EX Pokemon. But these new EX Pokemon were very different. They still shared the same trait of rewarding 2 prize cards when knocked out, but unlike the old EX Pokemon, these new ones were exclusively legendary and mythical Pokemon. Sure, there were also legendary and mythical EX Pokemon during the Ruby and Sapphire era, but we also had non-legendary EX Pokemon, as well as on top of that, Evolution EX Pokemon, but by far the biggest talking point of these cards were the HP values. While in today's format having high HP Pokemon is very common, I mean we now have basic Pokemon with 300 HP, back in the day it was very rare to see numbers this high. Even with Evolution Pokemon, the HP values were still fairly low, about 110 to 150 HP, and basic Pokemon you were looking at about 60, maybe 80, even for legendaries and mythicals. With base set Black and White, we already did see quite a jump in HP values. Reshiram and Zekrom, for example, had 130 HP, which might not seem like that big of a jump, but for the time it kind of was a big deal. These new EX Pokemon, however, had 170 to 180 HP, breaking the record for Pokemon cards with the highest HP that isn't Wailord. And to top it all off, these cards were incredibly mid. Zekrom EX saw play in some electric decks, Shaman EX didn't see play until 2 years later when we got Genesect and Virizion, and the others were pretty bad, all apart from one, and this one card went on to dominate every event for the rest of the year. This card was so strong that you yourself had to play it in order to counter your opponent's own copy. A card that on release was $60 to $65 just for the basic ultra rare version. That card was Mewtwo EX. This Hellspawn is a 170 HP Psychic type EX Pokemon with an incredibly strong attack, X-Ball. For 2 Colorless Energy, this attack did 20 damage times the amount of energy attached to this Pokemon and the defending Pokemon. That sounds pretty good, and this type of attack has been pretty common on a lot of cards even after its release, giving you the ability to punish decks and cards that require a lot of energy for their attacks, and with double Colorless Energy in the format, it's very easy to power up. However, this card would completely warp the format because, may I remind you that in the Black and White era, you could attack on your first turn, so we had another Sableye situation on our hands. If your opponent was unfortunate enough to start with 1 Pokemon and it didn't have a lot of HP, you could easily attach double Colorless Energy onto Mewtwo, use some plus powers, maybe a cheeky Celebi Prime for an extra energy, or 2, as it wasn't once per turn, and win the game on turn 1. But what if your opponent started with their own Mewtwo EX? It has 170 HP, it can't be one shot. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you can, because Mewtwo EX is weak to Psychic types, aka it was weak to itself, and thus the era of the Mewtwo Wars commenced. Starting with the 2012 European Challenge Cup, almost every deck in the room was playing Mewtwo EX. Even if you were playing a deck like Magnezone Prime, Electric Zekrom, Typhlosion Reshiram, Vileplume Control, you still had to play at least 1 or 2 copies of Mewtwo just to counter your opponent's own Mewtwo. However, Mewtwo's reign of terror was just getting started, as the next set of the Black and White era was approaching, and this set would bring along the perfect partner for Mewtwo, bringing about one of the most hated formats the Pokemon TCG has ever seen. Released in May of 2012, Dark Explorers would bring the second wave of EX Pokemon into the game, as well as some pretty powerful support cards for Darkness-type Pokemon specifically. Dark Patch is a very strong card letting you attach energy from your discard to Darkness-type Pokemon, and we also received Dark Claw, which increased the damage of your Darkness-type Pokemon by 20, but by far the strongest Darkness-type card from this set was Darkrai EX. A 180 HP Darkness-type Pokemon boasting one of the most broken abilities in the game, and on top of that, a very strong attack. Its ability Dark Cloak said that each of your Pokemon in play that has a Darkness energy attached has no retreat cost. This ability wasn't just limited to only Darkness type Pokemon. If any of your Pokemon had a Dark energy on them, they had free retreat. And given that decks were playing cards like Shaman from Unleashed, which when benched let you move energy between your Pokemon, you could very easily give any of your Pokemon free retreat by moving a Dark energy onto it. And then there was its attack. Night Spear, which for 2 Dark and 1 Colorless, did 90 damage and then 30 damage to one of your opponent's benched Pokemon. This card checkmated so many decks in the format. Evolution decks became almost extinct because of Darkrai, plus bench protection during this time was also non-existent, so any weak Pokemon on the bench were just easy picking. During the 2012 World Championships, Mewtwo Darkrai decks were everywhere. If you weren't playing it, then you were most likely losing to it. The deck was just that strong and also incredibly consistent. Dark Explorers also gave us the card Random Receiver, which made you reveal cards on the top of your deck until you found a supporter, letting you guarantee one every turn. Plus, most decks started playing Smeargle from Undaunted, which let you look at your opponent's hand and use a supporter card you find there as this Pokemon's ability, allowing you to use 2 supporter cards every turn, just like with Sableye, except it was now on an ability instead of an attack. But this card was also a double-edged sword, as you had to use a supporter card if you found one. It wasn't optional, so players would intentionally leave a supporter card in their hand that could be detrimental to their opponent, or a supporter card that was just completely useless. Darkrai Mewtwo quickly became the best deck in the game, a deck that could only be beaten by itself. These 2 cards caused a complete shift in the meta overnight, overshadowing every other deck in terms of power and went on to dominate the rest of the 2012 competitive season. Even after the 2012 rotation, which removed every set from the Heart Gold and Soul Silver era, the deck continued to be the best deck in the format and it seemed like nothing could stop it. However, towards the end of 2012 and into the start of 2013, the deck did start to fall off. Because instead of trying to balance out the format with new cards and new decks, Pokemon Company instead took a different approach of printing progressively stronger and stronger cards, to the point where the deck that power crept the entire format was about to be power crept itself. In August of 2012, we saw the release of Dragons Exalted, which not only brought the debut of Dragon-type Pokemon into the TCG, but also gave us some incredibly powerful cards. Ho-Oh EX and Rayquaza EX immediately started seeing competitive play. We also received a very decent rogue deck with Garchomp Altaria. Garbotoxin Garbodor made its debut in this set, and while it didn't see a huge amount of play right away, the card would become incredibly powerful later on in the X and Y and Sun and Moon era. In November, we saw the release of Boundaries Crossed, which gave us one of the strongest cards ever printed, Keldeo EX. This card saw play in every deck, but not in the same way that Mewtwo did. Its attack was very good, and the card did see play as a standalone deck being paired with Blastoise from the same set, but its ability Rush In was the main reason for its popularity, allowing you to switch it into the active spot, which helped greatly in situations where your opponent was trying to stall or retreat lock you. This set also introduced A-Spec cards into the game. These cards you were only allowed 1 copy of in your deck, and only 1 A-Spec could be used per deck, with the best one being a reprint of a very old card, Computer Search, which every deck started playing because it was the only good one. Moving into 2013, Darkrai Mewtwo was still around, but the format was becoming a lot more diverse, and new decks were starting to pop up, such as Ho-Oh, Rayquaza Electric, Keldeo Blastoise, and Landorus Mewtwo. Darkrai EX even started to become its own independent deck, opting to play Sableye from Dark Explorers, which could recover item cards from your discard. And then we saw the release of the Plasma series of sets, specifically Plasma Storm, released in February 2013, and Plasma Freeze, released in May of 2013. These 2 sets would go on to power creep the Pokemon TCG yet again. Some noteworthy cards from these sets were almost all of the Team Plasma Pokemon. Most of them were pretty terrible, but a couple of them were very strong, specifically Kyurem, Absol, Thundurus EX, Lugia EX, and Deoxys EX. We also saw cards such as Mr. Mime, which could protect your bench Pokemon, Black Kyurem EX, which saw playing Keldeo decks, being able to one-hit KO anything. Floatstone became a staple, allowing you to give any of your Pokemon free retreat, and when strapped onto a Keldeo EX, gave you a pivot into any of your other Pokemon. Superior Energy Retrieval, which greatly helped Keldeo decks recover back energy. And then there was one of the most toxic card combos ever printed, pun intended, Hypnotoxic Laser and Verbank City Gym. Hypnotoxic Laser not only poisoned your opponent's active Pokemon, but you also flip a coin, and if heads, it's also asleep. Combined with Verbank City Gym, which says poison Pokemon take an extra 20 damage between turns, you had one of the most hated cards in the game's history. At the 2013 World Championships, Mewtwo EX was basically gone by this point. Darkrai was still around and even ended up winning. However, looking at the top cut for the event, the format was diverse. You had multiple choices on what deck to play, and some of them had different variations and builds. The format was good again. The format was saved. And then in August, Plasma Blast came out and started a brand new Mewtwo War situation, this time with Genesect Virizion, but that's a story for another time. Next Destinies is seen as one of the most impactful sets to ever release in the game's history, and is also considered a huge turning point for the game in general. It was the set that brought back EX Pokemon, which have continued to be a main part of the game even to this day, and this will most likely continue until the game inevitably ends, whenever that is. While many people condemned their return as it completely changed the game and warped the entire format, over time they did become an integral part of the game, and the Pokemon Company did expand upon them, balancing them out, and even made alterations for each new generation. In the X and Y era we saw EX Pokemon that weren't just legendaries. Yes, they were still all basic Pokemon, despite being fully evolved forms, but it's something at least. We also saw the debut of M Pokemon, or Mega EX Pokemon. In the Sun and Moon era, EX Pokemon were changed to GX Pokemon, and instead of everything being a big basic, they brought back the evolution aspect from Ruby and Sapphire era. There was also Tag Team GX Pokemon, but we don't talk about them. The Sword and Shield era gave us V Pokemon, V Max Pokemon, and V Star Pokemon. And now in our current Scarlet and Violet Mega Evolution era, we have seen the return of EX Pokemon. They're designed in the same way GX Pokemon were in the Sun and Moon era. What started out as a series of cards everyone hated and many say nearly killed the game, have now evolved and become an integral part of the Pokemon TCG we know today. And I look forward to seeing how the Pokemon Company will continue to change and adapt these cards over the course of the game's lifespan. Without Next Destinies, without the Black and White era as a whole, we might not have seen the cards we have in the game today. It truly was the era that changed the Pokemon TCG forever.